picturesque outskirts of Banff, Alberta, Canada. In 2006, the Thornbridge family returned from their week-long summer vacation to find their mountain retreat in shocking disarray. The property, nestled among towering pines a few miles from the edge of protected wilderness, had been in Maxwell Thornbridge's family for generations. The area had long served as a critical wildlife corridor, with human settlements gradually encroaching on natural habitats over the decades. The Thornbridges, Maxwell, his wife Elaine, and their teenage children Harper and Reed, had spent 7 days visiting relatives in Vancouver, leaving their home securely locked. Upon arrival, they immediately noticed something was terribly wrong. The kitchen window had been shattered, glass fragments scattered across the countertop and floor. Inside, the destruction was extensive. Furniture overturned, upholstery shredded, and food containers torn apart and emptied. Maxwell initially suspected vandals or burglars, but as they cautiously moved through the first floor, distinct animal droppings and claw marks on the wooden door frames suggested a different culprit. The family proceeded carefully, documenting the damage for insurance purposes while keeping their voices low. The children stayed close to their mother as Maxwell investigated further. The strange, musky odor grew stronger near the basement door. Maxwell approached it carefully, noticing deep scratches in the wood. Placing his ear against the door, he froze. Unmistakable sounds of movement came from below. Something large was moving around in their basement. Maxwell whispered for his family to return to their vehicle immediately while he called the local wildlife authorities. Elaine ushered the children outside, but 16-year-old Reed insisted on staying with his father. Against better judgment, Maxwell allowed him to remain in the living room while he contacted emergency services. The dispatcher advised them to evacuate completely and wait for rangers to arrive, warning that a cornered wild animal could be extremely dangerous. As Maxwell ended the call, a tremendous crash echoed from behind the basement door, followed by the splintering of wood. Concerned the animal might break through before help arrived, Maxwell decided to check if the door was properly secured. This critical error in judgment nearly cost him his life. When Maxwell turned the handle to test the lock, the door burst open with explosive force. A medium-sized black bear, approximately 300 pounds and frenzied from captivity, charged through the opening. Disoriented and terrified after days trapped in the dark basement, the bear perceived Maxwell as a threat. Before he could react, the animal slammed into him, sending him tumbling backward down the basement stairs. Reed shouted from the living room, drawing the bear's attention momentarily. This gave Maxwell precious seconds to scramble behind an overturned workbench. The bear, confused by the multiple human scents and overwhelmed by its sudden freedom, paced aggressively at the bottom of the stairs, occasionally charging at Maxwell's makeshift barrier. From his defensive position, Maxwell grabbed a broomstick to keep the animal at bay while shouting instructions to his son. Reed, displaying remarkable composure, called emergency services again, emphasizing the dire situation while retreating to the relative safety of the kitchen. For nearly 20 harrowing minutes, Maxwell defended himself with the broomstick, receiving several glancing blows from the bear's powerful paws. Each time the animal charged, Maxwell jabbed at its sensitive nose, temporarily driving it back, but enraging it further. During one particularly aggressive assault, the bear's claws tore through Maxwell's jacket and into his side, leaving deep lacerations. Park rangers, Helena Yoshida and Bernard Clements, arrived with remarkable speed, entering through the front door with tranquilizer equipment. The bear, hearing new threats from above, renewed its aggression against Maxwell. Ranger Yoshida fired a tranquilizer dart, striking the bear's hindquarters. The animal roared and spun around, charging up the stairs toward the rangers. Ranger Clements deployed bear spray, creating a defensive chemical barrier while Yoshida reloaded. The bear hesitated, affected by the irritating spray, giving Yoshida the opportunity to fire a second dart. Within minutes, the tranquilizer took effect, and the bear collapsed in the narrow hallway between the basement and kitchen. Medical technicians arrived shortly afterward, finding Maxwell severely injured with 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and deep claw wounds across his torso and arms. The emergency team stabilized him before transport to a local hospital, where he would spend 11 days recovering. Wildlife authorities later determined the black bear, a 5-year-old male, had likely been attracted to the property by improperly stored garbage before the family's departure. After breaking through the kitchen window, it had eventually found its way to the basement, where the door had swung shut behind it. Trapped for approximately 6 days without adequate food or water, the animal had become increasingly desperate and destructive. The bear was relocated deep into backcountry territory, over 70 miles from human settlements, after veterinary examination. Conservation officer Priya Mehta explained that the bear's behavior was not predatory, but rather panic-driven, a desperate animal seeking escape rather than confrontation. The Thornbridge home required extensive repairs, totaling nearly $42,000. Insurance covered most of the damage, but the psychological impact proved far more lasting. Elaine insisted on installing advanced security systems and metal shutters on all ground floor windows. The children experienced nightmares for months following the incident, with Reed requiring counseling to process the trauma of nearly witnessing his father's death. Maxwell recovered physically, but developed a heightened awareness of wildlife proximity that bordered on paranoia. The basement was completely renovated, with the wooden door replaced by a reinforced metal security door. Despite these precautions, the family never quite felt safe in their home again. Every unexplained sound in the night brought renewed anxiety. The incident prompted local authorities to launch an educational campaign about proper food storage and waste management in wildlife-adjacent communities. The Thornbridge case was frequently cited in these materials as a sobering reminder that wilderness didn't always stay outside the front door. Their experience demonstrated how quickly an ordinary situation could transform into a life-threatening encounter when human settlements intersected with wild animal territories. In the frigid waters surrounding Kodiak Island, Alaska, in 1979, commercial fisherman Theodore Reinhardt encountered a situation so extraordinary that it would be recounted in maritime folklore for decades. Kodiak, located in the northern Gulf of Alaska, had been home to indigenous Alutiiq people for thousands of years before Russian colonization in the 18th century. Named for its massive brown bears, the largest subspecies of grizzly in the world, Kodiak's wilderness represented one of North America's last truly wild frontiers. Reinhardt, a 37-year-old third-generation fisherman of German Alutiiq descent, had been working these waters since adolescence. On that September morning, he set out alone in his 18-foot skiff, the Mariner's Dream, to check his crab pots in Kupreanov Strait, a narrow channel separating Kodiak from neighboring Afognak Island. The weather had been unusually clear with light winds, perfect conditions for the small vessel. The crossing between islands normally took approximately 40 minutes. Reinhardt had completed this journey hundreds of times throughout his career, familiar with every current and hidden reef. He had just passed the halfway point when he noticed something unusual in the water about 200 yards ahead, a dark object moving deliberately against the current. Initially, Reinhardt assumed it was a sea lion or perhaps a small whale, common sights in these productive waters. However, as the distance closed, he realized with astonishment that he was observing a massive Kodiak bear swimming across the channel. While bears occasionally swam between islands, witnessing one this far from shore was extremely rare. The animal appeared to be a mature male, its wet fur plastered against a frame that likely exceeded 1,100 pounds on land. Wildlife biologists would later speculate that unusually strong tidal currents had likely pulled the bear off course during what should have been a routine crossing at a narrower point of the strait. By the time Reinhardt encountered it, the animal had been swimming for possibly several hours and showed signs of exhaustion. Reinhardt reduced his engine speed and maintained distance, intending to observe the magnificent creature without disturbing its journey. He had been taught from childhood to respect the apex predators that shared the Kodiak archipelago. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated when the bear altered course, swimming directly toward the small boat. Whether drawn by curiosity, desperation for rest, or confusion due to exhaustion, remained unknown. What became immediately clear was the danger presented by an exhausted 1,000-pound predator attempting to board a vessel barely twice its length. Reinhardt increased throttle to create distance, but the bear pursued with surprising speed despite its fatigue. Within minutes, the animal reached the skiff's port side. Reinhardt quickly maneuvered to prevent the bear from gaining a foothold, but the creature's massive front paws gripped the gunwale. The small boat tilted dangerously under the sudden shift in weight. In a desperate attempt to counterbalance, Reinhardt cut the engine and shifted the skiff to starboard, hoping to regain control. But the bear's relentless efforts caused the vessel to capsize entirely. Thrown into 43-degree water, Reinhardt surfaced to find himself separated from the overturned skiff by about 15 feet, with the massive bear between them. In the ensuing confusion, the panicked animal, struggling to stay afloat, perceived Reinhardt's thrashing as a threat. It lunged toward him, slashing out with powerful paws in what wildlife experts would later describe as defensive behavior rather than predatory. Fighting hypothermia in the frigid water, Reinhardt spotted a floating wooden oar that had been dislodged from his vessel. As the bear approached again, he struck it repeatedly across the sensitive nose area. After several blows, the disoriented animal swam away, heading roughly toward Afognak Island, though clearly struggling against both the current and its exhaustion. Reinhardt, nearing hypothermia after nearly 20 minutes in the water, managed to reach his overturned skiff. Though unable to right the boat, he clung to the exposed hull for flotation. The emergency positioning beacon on his life vest had activated upon immersion, alerting Coast Guard authorities to his location. Nearly an hour later, the commercial fishing vessel, Northern Light, captained by Josephine Holloway, spotted the overturned skiff while returning from halibut grounds. Holloway and her crew rescued the severely hypothermic Reinhardt, administering emergency first aid and radioing for medical evacuation. Despite his core body temperature dropping to dangerous levels, Reinhardt survived, though with moderate lacerations to his left arm and shoulder from the bear's claws. The fate of the bear remained unknown. Search flights the following day found no sign of the animal along nearby shorelines. Marine biologists from the University of Alaska theorized that, given its exhaustion and the distance remaining to shore, the bear likely drowned, though its remarkable swimming endurance meant survival was still a possibility. Reinhardt's extraordinary encounter quickly spread through Kodiak's tight-knit fishing community. Initially met with skepticism, his account gained credibility when distinct claw marks matching Kodiak bear patterns were found on the recovered skiff. Maritime authorities officially documented the incident in their quarterly safety bulletin, creating the first record of a bear vessel interaction in open Alaskan waters. After 6 weeks of recovery, Reinhardt returned to fishing, but never again in a vessel smaller than 30 feet. He installed additional safety equipment and modified his routes to avoid known bear crossing points between islands. His experience led the Kodiak Fishermen's Association to include wildlife encounter protocols in their safety training programs. The incident became locally famous, eventually featured in Alaska Geographic magazine under the headline, "When Wilderness Swims." For Kodiak residents, Reinhardt's survival story served as a powerful reminder. Even on their remote island, the line between human domain and wilderness remained permeable and uncertain. At sea, the massive predators that gave the island its fearsome reputation could suddenly transform from distant wildlife into immediate, life-threatening reality. In the rugged backcountry of Colorado, 1995, a volunteer search and rescue team experienced a harrowing confrontation that would forever change wilderness emergency protocols. The area, characterized by steep ravines and dense pine forests, had historically been prime grizzly habitat before the species' extirpation in the 1950s. However, unconfirmed sightings in recent years had suggested possible natural recolonization from neighboring regions, reports largely dismissed by wildlife authorities as mistaken black bear identifications. The 5-person team had been dispatched to locate Charles and Marianne Hendrickson, experienced hikers from Minnesota, who had failed to return from a 3-day trek in the park's remote northwestern section. The search team consisted of team leader Bradford Wellington, a 20-year veteran of mountain rescues, medical technician Veronica Sandoval, communications specialist Timothy Zhao, wilderness guide Ophelia Jenkins, and Nathaniel Hollister, a former park ranger with extensive tracking experience. All had completed advanced wilderness first aid training and participated in numerous previous rescues in similar terrain. Their search began at the trailhead, following the Hendricksons' registered route plan. They maintained regular radio contact with base operations as they ascended beyond the tree line, methodically checking potential emergency campsites and shelter locations. After 8 hours of searching, Hollister discovered boot prints matching the missing hiker's pattern, descending off-trail toward a densely forested drainage, possibly indicating an attempt to seek shelter from the previous day's thunderstorms. Following this promising lead, the team descended into the ravine as afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape. At approximately 5:40 p.m., they entered a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines and discovered the Hendricksons' tent, damaged but intact, with supplies scattered nearby. Evidence suggested a hasty departure rather than animal damage, raising hopes the hikers might be found alive. Wellington instructed the team to establish a perimeter and begin methodical search patterns radiating from the campsite. Hollister and Sandoval took the northern quadrant, moving carefully through thick underbrush while calling the missing hikers' names. Approximately 200 yards from camp, they discovered fresh bear scat containing fabric scraps, an ominous sign that immediately elevated their concern. Hollister radioed Wellington with this development, and the team regrouped to reassess. While discussing next steps, they heard rustling in the vegetation approximately 30 yards east of their position. Initially hoping it might be the missing hikers, they were instead confronted by a massive grizzly bear emerging from behind a fallen tree. Later analysis of paw prints and witness descriptions confirmed what seemed impossible. A mature male grizzly, estimated at 650 pounds, had indeed recolonized this area. The animal likely protecting a nearby food cache containing the hikers' remains, charged without warning. Hollister, positioned closest to the animal's approach, had no time to deploy defense measures before the bear struck him with tremendous force, knocking him into a rocky outcropping and immediately mauling his torso and legs. Wellington and Jenkins simultaneously deployed bear spray, creating a defensive chemical cloud that temporarily drove the animal back. Zhao activated emergency protocols via radio, while Sandoval pulled medical supplies from her pack. The team dragged the severely injured Hollister toward a natural stone formation that offered partial protection on 3 sides. The bear, briefly disoriented by the pepper spray, retreated approximately 50 yards before circling back. Jenkins deployed a marine flare, creating both a visual and auditory deterrent that again temporarily repelled the animal. For nearly 45 minutes, the team alternated between treating Hollister's massive injuries and defending their position as the bear made repeated approach attempts from different angles. Sandoval's emergency medical training proved critical. Despite limited supplies, she managed to control Hollister's arterial bleeding and stabilize his condition enough to prevent immediate death. Wellington maintained constant communication with park headquarters, where rangers were organizing an armed response team and helicopter evacuation. As darkness approached, the bear's persistence increased. During one particularly aggressive charge, the animal came within 6 feet of the group before Jenkins struck it directly in the face with her aluminum trekking pole, momentarily stunning it. Wellington followed with a direct blast of bear spray to the animal's eyes and nasal passages, finally convincing it to abandon the confrontation. Rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, using spotlights to locate the team. Two ranger paramedics rappelled from the aircraft, while their colleagues provided armed security against potential bear return. Hollister, barely conscious and having lost dangerous amounts of blood, was evacuated first, followed by the remaining team members. At Denver Medical Center, surgeons worked for 11 hours to repair Hollister's extensive injuries, including compound fractures to both legs, severe lacerations across his torso and face, and internal organ damage. Though he survived, his recovery required 14 additional surgeries over 2 years, leaving him with permanent mobility limitations and extensive scarring. The fate of the Hendricksons was confirmed 3 days later when a heavily armed recovery team located their remains approximately a quarter mile from their campsite. Evidence indicated they had been killed by the same bear, likely after accidentally encountering it while hiking off trail. The incident fundamentally changed wildlife management policies. DNA analysis of hair samples collected at the attack site confirmed the animal was indeed a grizzly bear, forcing wildlife authorities to acknowledge natural recolonization had occurred. Mandatory bear canisters were implemented for all backcountry camping, ranger patrols in remote areas were expanded, and warning signage was installed at all trailheads. For the surviving rescue team members, the psychological impact proved as lasting as Hollister's physical injuries. Sandoval eventually left emergency medicine to become a wildlife conservation educator. Jenkins incorporated her experience into wilderness safety courses she developed for outdoor leadership programs. Wellington continued search and rescue work, but campaigned tirelessly for enhanced communication systems and weapon authorizations for rescue teams in predator territories. Later, the attack was extensively documented in a bestseller film called Return of the Silvertip, bringing attention to grizzly recolonization throughout the Rocky Mountain corridor. Despite ongoing debates about predator management, most biologists celebrated the bear's return as a sign of ecological recovery, while acknowledging the complex challenges of human-wildlife coexistence in increasingly shared landscapes. The incident became a case study in wildlife management courses nationwide, examining how human wilderness activity intersects with natural predator recovery. For Colorado residents, the confirmation of grizzlies' return transformed their relationship with wild spaces, adding both ecological significance and sobering reality to the understanding that wilderness remained truly wild, even in places where civilization seemed to have tamed the landscape. Dense, misty forests of a national park near Pokhara, Nepal, in November 2019, an experienced local hunter met a violent end after a fateful encounter with an Asiatic black bear. Pranav Rajesh Tamang, a 47-year-old hunter from the nearby village of Gandruk, had been tracking game in these forests since his teenage years. Known throughout the region for his exceptional skills in stalking prey and knowledge of animal behavior, Tamang had built a reputation as one of the most accomplished hunters in the district. His expertise had been passed down through generations, with hunting being a cultural tradition and occasional necessity for his family and community. On that fateful morning of November 12th, Tamang set out before dawn, accompanied by his occasional hunting companion and guide, Dorje Sherpa. Their expedition had a specific purpose: to track and hunt a wild boar that had repeatedly damaged crops in their village. Local farmers had reported significant losses, and Tamang had volunteered to address the problem. The pair ventured deeper into the forest than usual, following fresh tracks that suggested the boar had retreated further into the wilderness. The weather that day presented challenging conditions. A light but persistent drizzle reduced visibility and dampened the forest floor, making tracking easier and more dangerous. The moisture helped preserve clear footprints, but also masked sounds that might have otherwise alerted them to nearby predators. As the morning progressed, Tamang and Sherpa separated slightly to cover more ground, maintaining communication through occasional whistles, as was their custom. Around mid-morning, while moving through a particularly thick section of underbrush approximately 12 kilometers from their village, Tamang unknowingly approached the temporary den of an Asiatic black bear. The area, characterized by dense vegetation and several fallen trees, had created a natural shelter that the bear had claimed. Later investigation by wildlife authorities would suggest that the bear was likely a female with at least one cub nearby, though the cub was never located. According to Sherpa's account, he heard Tamang's surprised shout followed immediately by a roar. The distance between them, approximately 60 meters of dense forest, meant that Sherpa could not immediately see what was happening. Still, he immediately recognized the distinctive sound of an agitated bear. He reported rushing toward the commotion, calling out to Tamang while navigating the difficult terrain. By the time Sherpa reached the scene, the situation had already turned dire. He found Tamang on the ground, the bear standing over him. Tamang's rifle lay several meters away, unfired, suggesting he had either been unable to use it in time or had deliberately chosen not to shoot for fear of missing in the thick underbrush and further provoking the animal. Sherpa shouted and waved his arms to frighten the bear away from his fallen companion. The agitated and defensive bear turned briefly toward Sherpa before returning to Tamang. In a desperate attempt to save his friend, Sherpa fired a warning shot into the air with his rifle. The sudden noise finally startled the bear enough that it retreated into the forest, though not before inflicting catastrophic injuries on Tamang. Sherpa rushed to Tamang's side, finding him conscious but gravely wounded. The bear's powerful claws had caused deep lacerations across Tamang's chest and abdomen, and bite wounds to his shoulder had severed major blood vessels. Using his limited medical supplies, Sherpa attempted to control the bleeding while continuing to make noise to prevent the bear's return. He applied pressure bandages and administered a single pain medication from their emergency kit. Despite his significant injuries, Tamang remained lucid enough to instruct Sherpa to leave him and seek help. Sherpa refused, instead fashioning a makeshift stretcher from branches in his jacket. He swiftly transported Tamang back toward their village, making painfully slow progress over the difficult terrain. After covering approximately 2 kilometers, they encountered 3 village youths who had ventured into the forest to collect firewood. The young men, Kiran Magar, Deepak Gurung, and Sunil Thapa, immediately abandoned their task to assist. 2 ran ahead to alert the village and summon additional help, while the 3rd stayed with Sherpa to continue transporting Tamang. Despite their best efforts, Tamang's condition deteriorated rapidly. The blood loss was simply too severe, and the remote location meant professional medical help remained hours away. Approximately 3 hours after the attack, while still 4 kilometers from the village, Pranav Tamang succumbed to his injuries. His final words, as reported by Sherpa, acknowledged that the bear had been defending its territory and that he harbored no ill will toward the creature. When additional villagers reached them, they solemnly carried Tamang's body back to Gandruk, arriving after nightfall. The village health post worker, Sarita Pudel, officially pronounced him dead, listing massive trauma and blood loss as the cause. The community gathered to mourn one of their most respected members, with village elder Bhim Bahadur Gurung noting that Tamang had always emphasized respect for the forest and its inhabitants, even as he hunted within it. The incident prompted Nepal's National Office for Parks and Wildlife to investigate. Senior Wildlife Officer Ramesh Adhikari led a team that examined the attack site and interviewed witnesses. Their findings confirmed that the bear had likely protected either a food cache or cubs. Bears typically prepare for the leaner winter months in November by building fat reserves and establishing secure territories. In the following weeks of Tamang's death, local authorities conducted awareness programs, providing education about bear behavior and safety measures for those venturing into the forest. Rather than seeking retribution against the bear, the community, respecting Tamang's lifelong philosophy of coexistence with nature, requested better training and equipment for emergency medical response in remote areas. Dorje Sherpa, profoundly affected by the loss of his friend and his inability to save him despite his best efforts, eventually became an advocate for wildlife conservation in the region. He began working with local tourism boards to promote responsible trekking practices that minimized human-wildlife conflicts. As a testament to Tamang's influence, the bear remained unmolested, a powerful reminder of the beauty and danger inherent in one of Nepal's most precious natural landscapes. In the expansive wilderness of a national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming, during the late spring of 2022, what began as a routine wildlife survey nearly ended in tragedy when a team of park rangers unexpectedly encountered one of the park's most formidable predators. Senior wildlife biologist Dr. Ellison James Crawford led the four-person squad to the park's northeastern section, locally known as the Lamar Valley. This region, often called America's Serengeti for its abundant wildlife, had reported increased bear activity that spring. The team's mission was to document population movements and assess potential human-wildlife conflict zones. Crawford, a 15-year veteran of the Parks and Wildlife Service, was accompanied by field technician Valentina Ramirez, junior ranger Zachary Holloway, and seasonal researcher Priya Nagarajan. On May 18, 2022, the team established their research camp near a secluded tributary of Soda Butte Creek. The location offered excellent access to several wildlife corridors that they planned to monitor over the next 3 days. The area's topography featured scattered stands of lodgepole pines interspersed with open meadows, providing visibility and natural cover for their observation work. Spring wildflowers carpeted the valley, and recent rains had left the landscape vibrantly green. The team spent their first day setting up monitoring equipment, including trail cameras and non-invasive hair snares designed to collect DNA samples from passing bears. Weather conditions were ideal, clear skies with temperatures reaching the mid-60s Fahrenheit. That evening, they recorded their findings and planned the next day's routes while enjoying dinner at their campsite. Following standard park protocol, they properly secured all food items and scented products in bear-resistant containers, placed a regulation distance from their sleeping area. According to later reports, nothing during that first night suggested imminent danger. After breakfast, the team awoke early on May 19th and split into two groups to cover more ground. Crawford and Holloway headed northwest to check several camera stations, while Ramirez and Nagarajan moved southeast along the creek to assess potential den sites that had been previously mapped. Disaster struck at approximately 1:45 p.m. as the team prepared to reconvene at camp for their midday data comparison. Crawford and Holloway had just begun packing their equipment when they heard a distinctive huffing sound from a nearby thicket. Before either could react, a female grizzly erupted from the vegetation less than 30 yards away, charging directly toward them with remarkable speed. Holloway later recounted that Crawford immediately yelled for him to deploy his bear spray while attempting to create distance between them, a standard procedure to avoid both becoming targets of the same attack. As Crawford moved leftward, the bear momentarily hesitated before focusing its charge on him. Holloway discharged his bear spray, but a sudden gust of wind rendered it largely ineffective. The bear closed the distance to Crawford within seconds. Though he managed to deploy his spray, the bear was already too close for the deterrent to take full effect. The impact of the charging grizzly knocked Crawford to the ground, where the bear immediately began mauling him. Holloway, witnessing his colleague's peril, retrieved the team's emergency shotgun from his pack and fired a warning shot into the air. The loud report temporarily distracted the bear, which retreated several yards before turning toward Holloway. In this crucial moment, rather than firing at the animal, Holloway decided to retreat, reasoning that getting help for Crawford was the priority. He scrambled up a nearby slope while making loud noises to keep the bear's attention divided. His strategy proved partially successful. After a momentary pursuit of Holloway, the bear returned to Crawford, who had managed to roll into a protective position. The bear inflicted additional injuries before something in the distance, possibly the approaching voices of Ramirez and Nagarajan, who had heard the shotgun blast, caused it to flee into the forest abruptly. Holloway immediately returned to Crawford, finding him severely injured but conscious. Using their field radio, he contacted park emergency services while applying first aid to Crawford's wounds, which included deep lacerations to his back, shoulders, and scalp. along with defensive wounds on his forearms. Ramirez and Nagarajan arrived minutes later, having run toward the shotgun sound. Nagarajan, who had previous medical training, took over emergency care while Ramirez established a security perimeter and repeatedly used noisemakers to prevent the bear's return. The team moved Crawford to a small clearing where helicopter evacuation would be possible. The National Park's emergency response helicopter, staffed by flight paramedic Theodore Wilson and pilot Sophia McDermott, reached the location within 40 minutes of receiving the distress call. Wilson later described Crawford's injuries as severe but survivable due to his teammates' immediate and appropriate response. The helicopter transported Crawford to a medical center in Idaho Falls, the nearest Level 2 trauma center. Crawford spent 3 weeks in the hospital, followed by 4 months of intensive rehabilitation. The attack prompted the National Park's officials to review their field research protocols. New guidelines were implemented requiring teams to carry additional deterrence and communication devices. Training programs for seasonal staff were enhanced to include more extensive sections on bear behavior and appropriate responses to encounters. Crawford concluded with a simple yet powerful message that the wilderness remained wild, and they were privileged visitors who ought to learn to share the landscape with all its inhabitants, even those who reminded them of their vulnerability. Stark, icy wilderness of Norway's Svalbard archipelago. During the perpetual daylight of Arctic summer in 2018, an experienced wildlife photographer's passion for capturing the region's apex predator nearly cost him his life. Svalbard, located halfway between mainland Norway and the North Pole, comprises islands characterized by rugged mountains, massive ice fields, and desolate tundra. Sebastian Alaric Finnegan, a 42-year-old wildlife photographer from Melbourne, Australia, had built his reputation documenting endangered species across the globe. With numerous awards and publications in prestigious nature magazines, Finnegan was known for his willingness to endure extreme conditions to capture compelling images. His fascination with polar bears had brought him to Svalbard multiple times over the previous decade. Finnegan arrived in Longyearbyen, Svalbard's administrative center, on July 8, 2018. After consulting with local guides for several days and reviewing recent bear sightings, he chartered a small boat with experienced Arctic guide Ingrid Johansson to explore the remote northeastern coast of Spitsbergen, Svalbard's largest island. The area, part of the Nordost Svalbard Nature Reserve, was known for its healthy polar bear population, but required special permits and strict adherence to safety protocols for human visitors. The expedition began favorably. On July 12th, Finnegan and Johansson spotted several bears hunting along the ice edge, allowing Finnegan to capture impressive telephoto images from the safety of their boat. However, Finnegan expressed interest in obtaining ground-level photographs showing the bears in the context of their increasingly fragile habitat. Images, he believed, would more powerfully communicate the species' vulnerability to climate change. After careful consideration and extensive safety planning, Johansson agreed to accompany Finnegan onto a stable shore area on July 14th. They selected a location with good visibility and multiple escape routes, and both carried high-powered rifles, standard safety equipment in Svalbard, where the law requires armed protection when venturing outside settlements. Additionally, they brought flare guns, bear spray, and portable tripwire alarm systems to establish a secure perimeter for their temporary observation blind. According to Johansson's subsequent account, the first 6 hours ashore proceeded without incident. From their camouflaged position approximately 300 meters inland from the shore, they observed a female bear with a single yearling cub hunting seals along the ice edge. Finnegan successfully photographed the pair, though he repeatedly expressed disappointment with the distance, believing his images lacked the intimate quality he sought. At approximately 8:30 p.m., despite the midnight sun illuminating the landscape with perpetual daylight, Visibility deteriorated as a fog bank rolled in from the sea, a common occurrence in Svalbard's summer. Johansen immediately suggested they retreat to their boat until conditions improved, but Finnegan requested just 15 more minutes to capture the bears in the atmospheric mist. This decision, delaying their withdrawal as visibility decreased, would prove nearly fatal. While preparing to leave, their attention focused on packing camera equipment. Neither noticed a lone male bear approaching from downwind. Unlike the mother and cub they had been observing, this bear had moved inland, possibly following their scent. Arctic wildlife experts later suggested that diminishing sea ice had likely increased the bear's food stress, making any potential food source, including humans, worth investigating. The bear was approximately 40 meters away when Johansen finally spotted it through the fog. She immediately alerted Finnegan and reached for her rifle, but Finnegan, rather than retreating, raised his camera for what he would later describe as the shot of a lifetime. This momentary delay proved costly. The bear, perhaps interpreting their movements as threatening or simply responding to curiosity, charged with the explosive speed characteristic of polar bears. Johansen fired a warning shot, but the bear continued its advance. As she prepared to fire directly at the animal, standard protocol when human life is in imminent danger, the bear veered sharply toward Finnegan, who stood partially exposed from their blind, camera still raised. The attack happened with shocking speed. The bear, estimated to weigh approximately 1,000 pounds, knocked Finnegan to the ground with a powerful swipe. Johansen immediately fired at the bear but missed in the poor visibility and chaotic situation. She quickly chambered another round and fired again as the bear began mauling Finnegan, this time striking the animal in the shoulder. The wounded bear retreated several meters, but remained agitated and focused on Finnegan. In a desperate maneuver, Johansen fired multiple flares between the bear and Finnegan while approaching her injured companion. The combination of the wound and the flare's intense light and noise finally drove the bear away into the fog. Johansen quickly assessed Finnegan's condition, finding him conscious but severely injured with deep lacerations across his torso and a partially crushed left shoulder. Using their satellite phone, Johansen contacted Svalbard's emergency services. Due to the remote location and hazardous flying conditions caused by the fog, the rescue helicopter from Longyearbyen would face significant challenges reaching them. Johansen established a defensive perimeter with remaining flares and began administering first aid from their emergency kit, applying pressure bandages to Finnegan's most severe wounds, while continuously scanning for the bear's return. Johansen maintained this vigil for nearly 3 hours, periodically updating emergency services on Finnegan's deteriorating condition, while watching for both the rescue helicopter and the wounded bear. When Finnegan lost consciousness due to blood loss and shock, she made the difficult decision to attempt moving him back to their boat, despite the risk of aggravating his injuries. Using their equipment tarp as an improvised stretcher, she began the arduous process of dragging him toward the shore. After covering approximately 100 meters, Johansen heard the welcome sound of approaching rotor blades. Pilot Lars Eriksson and paramedic Sonja Christiansen had managed to navigate through breaks in the fog to reach their position. The rescue team quickly stabilized Finnegan and transported him to a hospital in Tromsø on the mainland. Surgeon Dr. Magnus Larsson led the team that worked for 11 hours to repair Finnegan's extensive injuries. These included 4 broken ribs, a shattered left scapula, a punctured lung, and deep tissue damage requiring over 300 stitches across multiple wound sites. Remarkably, none of his injuries proved fatal or permanently debilitating, though his recovery would require months of intensive rehabilitation. The incident prompted Svalbard authorities to review their regulations regarding wildlife photography expeditions. The governor implemented new requirements for photographers, including mandatory advanced safety training and stricter protocols for ground-based observation. Additionally, all photography permits now require submission of detailed safety plans specifically addressing changing weather conditions. For her part, Johansen received Norway's Medal for Heroic Deeds for her actions during the crisis. Though deeply affected by the traumatic experience, she continued her work as an Arctic guide after taking several months off to process the events. She became an outspoken advocate for responsible wildlife tourism that balances human interest with animal welfare and safety. On the anniversary of the attack, Finnegan returned to Svalbard, not to photograph bears, but to participate in climate research and to help train new guides in safety protocols. Standing on the shore near where his near-fatal encounter occurred, he reflected that his greatest regret was not the injuries he sustained, but the fact that a bear lost its life because of human error. He told assembled journalists that every polar bear was precious in a warming world. His mistake cost one its life, and that was a debt he could never repay except by working to ensure their future on this planet. In the rugged wilderness of Alaska's Kodiak Island, September 12, 2022, marked the beginning of moose hunting season, drawing experienced outdoorsmen to the remote backcountry. Among them was Everett Nathaniel Blackwood, a 43-year-old commercial fisherman and lifelong Alaskan who had been hunting these lands since childhood. Kodiak Island, the second-largest island in the United States, had been home to the massive Kodiak brown bear for thousands of years before Russian fur traders arrived in the late 18th century. These bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, had evolved in isolation on the island, growing to tremendous sizes due to the abundant salmon runs and diverse food sources. Wildlife biologists estimated that approximately 3,500 Kodiak bears inhabited the island, creating one of the highest bear densities anywhere on the planet. Blackwood and his hunting partner, Marcus Jamison Holloway, had secured permits for a week-long hunt in the island's southwestern region, a remote area characterized by narrow valleys, dense alder thickets, and marshy lowlands. The two men had established their base camp near Terror Lake, rising before dawn on that fateful Monday to begin their search for bull moose moving down from higher elevations. According to Holloway's subsequent statement to Alaska Department of Fish and Game officials, they had decided to split up that morning to cover more ground, planning to maintain radio contact every hour. Blackwood had taken the older route following Miller Creek, while Holloway explored a ridge system to the north. Both men were traveling on ATVs, standard transportation for accessing Alaska's challenging backcountry terrain. Weather conditions that morning were typical for early fall on Kodiak, overcast with intermittent drizzle and fog patches forming in low-lying areas. Visibility varied from several hundred yards on open ground to mere feet in the thicker vegetation. The moisture dampened sounds, creating deceptively quiet conditions despite the ATV engines. At approximately 7:40 a.m., Holloway reported hearing Blackwood's ATV accelerate suddenly over their radio connection, followed by what Holloway described as a terrible crashing sound, followed by silence. His immediate attempts to contact his partner went unanswered. Concerned, Holloway abandoned his position and headed toward Blackwood's last known coordinates, a journey that took almost 20 minutes over the challenging terrain. The scene Holloway discovered would haunt him for years to come. Blackwood's ATV lay on its side in a small clearing, its frame severely damaged on one side. His friend lay partially beneath it, gravely injured and barely conscious. Just visible through the alder thickets, some 30 yards away, was the massive form of a Kodiak bear, seemingly watching from the edge of the vegetation. Holloway fired several shots into the air, causing the bear to retreat deeper into the thicket. He then rendered emergency aid to Blackwood, who had sustained catastrophic internal injuries and was bleeding profusely. Despite his efforts to stabilize his friend and his immediate call for emergency assistance via satellite phone, Blackwood's condition deteriorated rapidly. The Alaska Air National Guard rescue helicopter, dispatched from Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, arrived approximately 85 minutes after Holloway's distress call. By then, Blackwood had succumbed to his injuries. The medical examiner in Anchorage later determined that he had suffered massive trauma to his chest and abdomen, consistent with being crushed between the ATV and the ground with tremendous force. Dr. Raylene Victoria Summers, the state's chief wildlife biologist for the Kodiak region, led the investigation into the fatal encounter. Based on tracks and other evidence at the scene, she reconstructed the likely sequence of events. Blackwood had been traveling along a narrow section of trail that curved around a blind corner, heavily shrouded by alder growth. The bear, possibly a large male estimated at over 1,500 pounds, had been moving along the same trail from the opposite direction. In her official report, Dr. Summers noted that the physical evidence suggested a sudden, surprise encounter at very close range. She explained that neither the human nor the bear had any advance warning. She added that the ATV had been traveling at approximately 12 to 15 miles per hour when Blackwood rounded the corner and encountered the bear at a distance of less than 10 feet. The investigation determined that the bear had likely struck the ATV's left side with enough force to flip the vehicle, pinning Blackwood beneath it. The animal then retreated a short distance but remained in the vicinity, exhibiting what biologists referred to as defensive rather than predatory behavior. Game wardens and wildlife specialists tracked the bear for 3 days following the incident, eventually locating and identifying it through distinguishing scars and size characteristics. Although some local residents demanded the animal be destroyed, wildlife authorities ultimately decided against euthanasia, concluding that the bear had reacted defensively to a surprise encounter rather than exhibiting predatory behavior toward humans. The incident prompted the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to implement new safety guidelines for ATV users in bear country, including recommendations for reduced speeds in areas with limited visibility and the installation of bear bells or other noise-making devices to alert wildlife to human presence. At the memorial service held in the small fishing community of Old Harbor, Holloway recalled his friend as the most careful outdoorsman he had ever known. He noted the tragic irony that Blackwood had always emphasized safety and caution in the backcountry. A collection taken at the service established the Everett Blackwood Wilderness Safety Fund, which now provides bear safety equipment to hunters and fishermen throughout the Kodiak archipelago. Wildlife officials throughout Alaska use the incident as a teaching case in hunter safety courses, emphasizing that even motorized vehicles provide no protection against the overwhelming force of North America's largest land predators. The blind corner where Blackwood met his fate is now marked with a small metal plaque, a somber reminder that in Alaska's wilderness, humans and bears share the same narrow trails, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. As Dr. Summers noted in her final assessment, in such encounters there is rarely malice on either side, only the unfortunate collision of two species, each surprised by the other, in a landscape that primarily belongs to the bears. The vast, untamed wilderness of Wyoming's Absaroka mountain range has long drawn hunters seeking both game and solitude. On October 3, 2018, these mountains became the setting for a harrowing encounter that would test one man's will to survive and forever change his relationship with the wild places he loved. Montgomery Prescott Harrington, a 47-year-old architectural engineer from Jackson Hole, had been hunting elk in Wyoming's backcountry for over 2 decades. Each autumn, Harrington would take a week-long solo hunting trip, accompanied only by his loyal German shepherd, Kodiak. This tradition had become sacred to him, a necessary reconnection with the rugged landscape that had drawn his grandfather to Wyoming in the 1940s. The Absaroka Range supports diverse wildlife populations, including an estimated 700 grizzly bears that roam freely across the ecosystem. Since the grizzly's listing as a threatened species in 1975, their numbers had steadily increased, creating more frequent opportunities for human-bear encounters. Harrington had secured a permit for elk hunting in the remote thoroughfare region, often described as the most isolated area in the contiguous United States. His detailed trip itinerary, later recovered from his truck, indicated that he had planned to spend 3 days hunting the high ridges above the river's headwaters, an area known for its healthy elk population and challenging terrain. On the second day of his expedition, Harrington was tracking a small herd of elk that had been moving through a high meadow surrounded by lodgepole pine forest. According to his later account, he had shot and wounded a bull elk around mid-morning, then spent several hours following its blood trail through increasingly dense timber. Kodiak, though not formally trained as a tracking dog, was helping locate the blood sign. At approximately 2:15 p.m., the trail led Harrington into a small clearing where he made a discovery that experienced hunters in grizzly country dread. A bear had claimed his wounded elk. The massive adult male grizzly, later estimated at around 600 pounds, had already begun feeding on the carcass, tearing open the abdominal cavity to access the nutrient-rich organs. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying speed characteristic of grizzly encounters. Kodiak, detecting the bear's scent, began barking and moved aggressively toward the carcass. The grizzly, displaying typical food-guarding behavior, charged immediately. Harrington reported that he had just enough time to unsling his rifle and fire a hurried warning shot into the air, hoping to deter the charge. The shot did nothing to dissuade the bear, which struck Kodiak with a powerful blow before turning its attention to Harrington. The hunter was knocked to the ground, his rifle thrown several yards away by the impact. In the chaotic seconds that followed, the grizzly inflicted severe lacerations to Harrington's arms and chest as he attempted to shield his face and neck, critical survival behavior that likely saved his life. Harrington later recalled that the attack seemed to last an eternity, but actually continued for approximately 45 seconds before the bear suddenly broke off the assault and returned to the elk carcass. Though severely injured and losing blood, Harrington managed to retrieve his rifle and retreat from the clearing, while the bear was momentarily distracted. Over the next 3 hours, Harrington navigated nearly 7 kilometers of difficult terrain with multiple serious injuries, including a partially collapsed lung and significant blood loss. His survival skills were tested to their limits as he applied makeshift bandages from his hunting shirt and used his compass to locate the nearest ranger station. Wyoming Game and Fish Department officer Charlotte Victoria Edmondson was manning the remote Thoroughfare Ranger Station when Harrington stumbled onto the porch shortly after 5:30 p.m. Edmondson, a former combat medic, provided critical first aid while coordinating an emergency helicopter evacuation through satellite communications. The rescue helicopter arrived at 7:45 p.m. and transported Harrington to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center in Idaho Falls, where he underwent multiple surgeries. Remarkably, Kodiak had not perished in the encounter, as initially feared. The resilient shepherd had fled into the forest after being struck by the bear. 4 days later, a search party organized by Harrington's brother located the dog approximately 3 miles from the attack site. Though dehydrated and suffering from minor injuries, Kodiak had survived by finding shelter in a hollow log. Wildlife biologist Dr. Gabriella Jane Weatherby led the investigation into the incident, concluding that the encounter represented a textbook case of food-guarding aggression. Using DNA samples collected from Harrington's clothing and the attack site, authorities identified the specific bear, a 12-year-old male with an established territory throughout the region. After considerable discussion, wildlife managers decided against euthanizing the animal, determining it had exhibited normal defensive behavior rather than predatory aggression toward humans. During his 3-month recovery, Harrington became an outspoken advocate for bear awareness and proper hunting practices in grizzly country. He established the Wilderness Coexistence Foundation, which now provides bear spray and safety training to hunters throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Harrington later told a wildlife conservation symposium in Jackson that the bear had been doing exactly what nature had designed it to do. He admitted that he had been the visitor in its home and made a critical error by not making enough noise when tracking wounded game. He added that the mistake had nearly cost him his life. Harrington's experience has become a cornerstone case study in hunter education throughout Wyoming, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, proper equipment, and understanding predator behavior when pursuing game in grizzly habitat. His survival, wildlife officials note, resulted from a combination of trained response, physical resilience, and extraordinary fortune. As Harrington often concluded in his frequent safety presentations, he emphasized that there was a thin line between being the hunter and becoming the hunted in grizzly country. He added that respecting that line meant coming home with stories rather than becoming one. The remote Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, situated halfway between mainland Norway and the North Pole, has long been recognized as one of Earth's most extreme human settlements. On August 15, 2021, the archipelago's precarious balance between human activity and raw wilderness was dramatically illustrated when a routine fishing expedition transformed into a life-threatening wildlife encounter. Svalbard's stark landscape, where rugged mountains meet the Arctic Ocean, has been shaped by millennia of glacial activity. The archipelago's history began with its discovery by Dutch explorer Willem Barents in 1596, followed by centuries of whaling, trapping, and coal mining operations. Modern Svalbard has evolved into a unique research community, where approximately 2,400 residents from nearly 50 nations navigate life in the high Arctic, sharing the islands with an estimated 3,000 polar bears, a population that outnumbers human inhabitants. Henrik Johannes Magnusson, 41, a Norwegian marine biologist stationed at Longyearbyens research facility, had organized a weekend fishing expedition to investigate declining Arctic cod populations in the fjords east of Spitsbergen, Svalbard's largest island. Accompanying him were Swedish glaciologist Astrid Ingrid Lindholm, 38, Finnish mechanical engineer Matti Tapani Virtanen, 45, and Canadian wildlife photographer Carson William Thompson, 52. All four had completed Svalbard's mandatory polar bear safety training, required for anyone traveling outside settlement boundaries. The group departed Longyearbyen Harbor at 6:30 a.m. aboard Magnusson's 7-meter research vessel, the Arctic Endeavour. Their destination was Hinlopen Strait, a nutrient-rich channel between Spitsbergen and Nordaustlandet Islands, approximately 4 hours navigation from their departure point. Weather conditions were typical for late summer in the archipelago. Overcast with occasional fog patches, temperatures hovering around 3 degrees Celsius, and moderate northeasterly winds. What the expedition members could not have anticipated was how dramatically Arctic climate change had altered traditional polar bear behavior patterns in the region. According to subsequent analysis by Dr. Elisabeth Christine Petersen of the Norwegian Polar Institute, the summer of 2021 had seen record-breaking sea ice retreat across the Barents Sea, forcing many bears to remain on land for extended periods, depleting their energy reserves and increasing the likelihood of human encounters. The fishing team reached their research site at approximately 10:45 a.m. and spent several hours collecting specimens and environmental data along the coastline of Wilhelmøya, a small island in the strait. As evening approached, they anchored in a sheltered cove to prepare their evening meal and organize their samples. Magnusson later reported that they had followed all standard safety protocols, including maintaining a continuous watch rotation and storing food in bear-resistant containers. At approximately 7:20 p.m., as the group worked around a small shore camp they had established for sample processing, Lindholm noticed movement along the rocky beach approximately 200 meters north of their position. A large adult male polar bear, later estimated to weigh around 500 kilograms, was moving deliberately toward their camp, exhibiting what wildlife officials would later classify as purposeful approach behavior, a concerning deviation from the typical cautious demeanor bears usually display toward human activity. Following established safety procedures, the group immediately began breaking camp to retreat to their vessel. Thompson, positioned furthest from the boat, activated a handheld flare while the others gathered essential equipment. The bear, however, did not respond to the visual deterrent as expected, and instead increased its pace toward the humans. Virtanen, attempting to create additional distance between Thompson and the approaching predator, shouted and waved his arms while moving laterally away from the boat. This action appeared to redirect the bear's attention, but rather than retreat, the animal charged directly toward the Finnish engineer. Despite Virtanen's attempt to deploy bear spray, the polar bear closed the distance with characteristic speed, knocking him to the ground before he could effectively discharge the deterrent. The bear seized Virtanen's left arm in its jaws while Thompson and Magnusson rushed toward the attack, deploying both bear spray and signal flares at close range. The combined assault forced the bear to release Virtanen and retreat a short distance, allowing the injured man to be pulled toward the vessel. However, the bear circled and approached again, exhibiting unusual persistence. Lindholm retrieved the expedition's emergency firearm, a mandatory safety requirement in Svalbard, and fired 2 warning shots that finally drove the bear into nearby rocks. The team immediately transported Virtanen to their vessel and radioed for emergency assistance while applying pressure bandages to his severely lacerated arm and treating him for shock. The Svalbard governor's office dispatched a rescue helicopter from Longyearbyen, which reached the fishing vessel at 8:55 p.m. and airlifted Virtanen to Longyearbyen Hospital. He underwent emergency surgery to repair extensive tissue damage and severed tendons in his left forearm and upper arm. Though the injuries required months of rehabilitation, doctors were able to preserve full function of his hand and arm. Wildlife protection officers located and tranquilized the bear the following day. Examination revealed the animal was severely undernourished, weighing approximately 30% less than typical for its age and size. Blood samples indicated elevated stress hormones and evidence of prolonged fasting. After considerable discussion among conservation authorities, wildlife managers made the difficult decision to relocate rather than euthanize the bear, transporting it by helicopter to the northern coast of Nordaustlandet, where sea ice conditions remained more favorable. Dr. Pedersen's subsequent investigation highlighted how climate disruption was fundamentally altering the relationship between humans and polar bears in the archipelago. In her official report, she noted that what they had witnessed during the incident represented a potential preview of future human-bear interactions across the Arctic. She explained that as sea ice patterns became increasingly unstable, they were observing more bears spending longer periods on land, depleting their energy reserves, and sometimes exhibiting more risk-tolerant behavior around human settlements and activities. Following the incident, Svalbard authorities implemented enhanced safety regulations for all expeditions outside settlement zones, including mandatory satellite tracking devices, improved bear deterrent requirements, and expanded safety training focused specifically on encounters with nutritionally stressed bears. After his recovery, Virtanen joined Magnuson in establishing the Arctic Coexistence Initiative, which now develops and tests improved deterrent technologies for scientific field teams working in polar bear habitats. Their work has been adopted by research stations across the circumpolar north. Later, during a polar safety conference in Tromsø, Virtanen explained that the bear had not been malicious but desperate. He emphasized that, as they continued their work in the Arctic, they needed to recognize that they were entering an era where traditional assumptions about wildlife behavior might no longer apply. He concluded that their presence in bear territory demanded even greater respect and preparation than ever before. In the remote foothills of eastern Wyoming in 2011, veteran hunter Carl Weston was tracking a rogue grizzly that had been terrorizing local cattle ranches for months. The Bighorn Mountain region had always been known for its wildlife, but this particular bear had become infamous across 3 counties. Historically, the area had seen its share of predator livestock conflicts since settlers first arrived in the 1800s, but nothing compared to the destruction this single animal had caused. The bear had destroyed livestock worth thousands of dollars across multiple properties, leaving mangled carcasses and broken fences in its wake. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the beast, a scarred, massive grizzly rumored to weigh over 1,200 pounds, with a distinctive white patch on its chest and a notched left ear. Some claimed it was unnaturally aggressive, perhaps due to an old hunting injury that had left it unable to hunt natural prey efficiently. Whatever the reason, Carlton had been hired to end the threat once and for all. A former wildlife officer with 27 years of hunting experience, Weston took the assignment seriously. For weeks, he studied the bear's patterns, following broken branches, paw prints nearly 14 inches across, and scattered remains of its kills. The ranchers needed someone with his expertise, as the bear had become increasingly bold, approaching ranch buildings and showing no fear of humans, a dangerous development that couldn't be ignored. On October 15th, after tracking the animal for 17 days, Weston rose before dawn and positioned himself downwind from what he believed was the bear's primary travel route between feeding grounds. The morning air carried a biting chill as he settled into position near a dense thicket bordering Harlow Creek. Armed with his trusted 45-70 lever-action rifle, he waited patiently as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pines. The attack came without warning. Rather than approaching along the trail as expected, the massive grizzly had somehow circled behind him. Weston heard only a brief rustle before the bear exploded from the thick brush merely 30 yards away, charging at full speed. The hunter barely had time to shoulder his rifle before the animal closed half the distance between them. His first shot struck the bear's shoulder, a solid hit that would have dropped most animals instantly. The grizzly faltered momentarily, but continued its charge with renewed fury. Weston's second round punched into the bear's chest, yet incredibly, it kept coming. Time seemed to slow as the hunter worked the lever of his rifle with practiced precision, firing again and again as the distance between them vanished. The third and fourth shots hit the bear's upper body, drawing blood but failing to stop its momentum. At 20 feet, Weston could see the rage in the animal's eyes and smell its musty fur. His fifth shot struck the bear's neck, causing it to stumble slightly but not fall. The sixth round hit just below the jaw as the bear rose to its full height, towering nearly 9 feet tall on its hind legs. With the grizzly barely 10 feet away, Weston fired his 7th and final round directly into the bear's chest cavity. The massive animal crashed forward, sliding to a stop just short of the hunter's boots. The entire encounter had lasted less than 15 seconds. Drenched in sweat and spattered with blood, Weston sat down heavily on a nearby log, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he realized how close he had come to being torn apart. It took 30 minutes before he could steady himself enough to use his satellite phone to call the nearest ranch for assistance. When ranch hands Tobias Blackwood and Javier Montez arrived 2 hours later with a truck and winch, they were awestruck by the bear's size. Even experienced outdoorsmen, they admitted they had never seen anything like it. The animal required all 3 men and specialized equipment to load onto the vehicle. Later examination confirmed the bear weighed 1,153 pounds, making it one of the largest grizzlies ever documented in Wyoming. Its necropsy revealed old bullet fragments lodged in its hip and shoulder, likely explaining its inability to hunt natural prey and its resulting aggression toward livestock. Wildlife authorities estimated the bear was approximately 18 years old, with teeth worn from age and battle. Weston's encounter quickly became legendary across the region. Local newspaper editor Priscilla Hargrove wrote a front-page story titled 7 Rounds, the Monster of Bighorn County, which was picked up by outdoor publications. Ranch owner Frederick Hollister presented Weston with a custom knife made from the bear's claw as a token of appreciation for ending the threat to local livelihoods. In the years that followed, Carlton occasionally gave talks at hunting safety courses about the importance of proper caliber selection and shot placement. He emphasized that his survival had been as much about preparation and training as it was about luck. The mounted bear eventually found a home in the county museum, where it continued to draw visitors curious about the legendary animal that required 7 rounds to bring down. Weston himself never hunted bear again, claiming that after looking into the eyes of such a magnificent creature at point-blank range, something in him had changed. He continued to hunt deer and elk, but focused more on conservation work in his later years. The experience had given him a profound respect for the wilderness that still existed in even the most settled parts of Wyoming, and a first-hand understanding of humanity's tenuous position in the natural order. In the remote village of Verkhoyansky, nestled at the edge of Siberia's vast wilderness, in 1998, 3 teenage boys ventured along a forest trail for an afternoon of exploration. The village, established in the mid-19th century by fur trappers and later expanded during industrial development, had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the surrounding taiga forest. Local history recounted numerous encounters with wildlife, though serious incidents had been rare in recent decades, as human activity pushed animals deeper into shrinking wilderness areas. Dmitry Volkov, Pyotr Sokolov, and Nikolai Baranov, all aged 16, had grown up together in the tight-knit community of barely 400 residents. Despite frequent warnings from elders about respecting wilderness boundaries, the boys had developed a comfortable familiarity with the forest's edge. That spring afternoon, they traveled along an established path approximately 2 kilometers from the village outskirts, searching for a rumored abandoned weather station. The weather that day had been unusually warm for early May, with temperatures reaching 15 degrees Celsius, drawing many wildlife species out of winter hibernation and into active foraging. The boys had been noisy during their hike, carelessly snapping branches and throwing stones at trees, behavior that would later be cited as potentially attracting attention from predators. Around 3 o'clock, as they crossed into a less frequently traversed section of forest, Pyotr spotted movement in the dense underbrush approximately 30 meters ahead. Before he could alert the others, a massive Ussuri brown bear, sometimes called the Russian grizzly, emerged from between 2 fallen logs. The animal, later estimated by wildlife officials to weigh nearly 800 pounds, stood motionless, assessing the intruders in its territory. The boys froze in terror as survival instincts conflicted with their panic. Nikolai, positioned closest to the bear, made the fatal decision to run. Wildlife experts would later explain that this triggered the bear's predatory chase response. The massive animal charged forward with surprising speed, covering the distance in seconds. Dmitri and Pyotr scattered in opposite directions as Nikolai sprinted toward a clearing that might have offered visibility to the village. The bear overtook Nikolai within 60 meters, striking him from behind with enough force to throw him several feet forward. What happened next occurred largely out of sight of the other boys, though Pyotr, having scrambled up an embankment, witnessed portions of the attack through dense foliage. The bear's assault was brief but catastrophic, causing massive traumatic injuries. Dmitri had fled in the direction of the village, but became disoriented in the thick forest. Pyotr, having witnessed the attack's beginning, had retreated in the opposite direction. In his panic, he fell down a steep ravine, suffering a compound fracture to his left leg and multiple lacerations. Despite excruciating pain, he managed to drag himself toward a dilapidated fence, marking an old boundary between village hunting grounds and protected forest. The fence provided minimal protection, but its weathered wooden posts allowed Pyotr to pull himself upright. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch and fighting against shock and blood loss, he moved painfully along the fence line. Nearly 2 hours after the attack, he located an area where cell reception was strong enough to make an emergency call to the village. Retired hunter Pavel Korznikov was passing near the forest edge on his tractor when he heard faint cries for help. Following the sounds, he discovered Pyotr collapsed against the fence, barely conscious from blood loss and exposure. Korznikov immediately transported the injured teenager to the village clinic while alerting local authorities about the attack and Nikolai's unknown status. A search party consisting of village men with hunting experience mobilized within the hour, equipped with rifles and tracking dogs. Led by veteran tracker Yuri Petrov, they located Nikolai's body shortly before dusk. The scene confirmed their worst fears. The teenager had not survived the bear's attack. Dmitri was found several hours later, hiding in a hollow log approximately 1 kilometer from the attack site, physically unharmed but suffering from severe psychological trauma. Wildlife authorities from the regional capital arrived the following day to investigate. Conservation officer Arkady Morozov confirmed through paw print measurements and attack patterns that the animal had been an adult male Ussuri brown bear, likely recently emerged from hibernation and potentially undernourished. Evidence suggested the bear had been startled by the teen's presence, rather than stalking them as prey, but had responded with lethal force when Nikolai fled. Pyotr underwent multiple surgeries at the regional hospital, eventually recovering from his physical injuries, though requiring extensive rehabilitation for his shattered leg. Psychological recovery proved more challenging, as he experienced severe post-traumatic stress disorder that prevented him from venturing near forested areas for years afterward. The village held a funeral for Nikolai 5 days after the attack. The tragedy profoundly affected the small community, with many families imposing strict restrictions on children's activities outside village boundaries. Local schools implemented enhanced wildlife safety education, emphasizing proper behavior during animal encounters. Regional authorities organized a controlled hunt for the bear, though it was never definitively located. Trail cameras installed after the incident captured images of 3 different adult male bears in the vicinity, suggesting the area supported more predators than previously understood. The village council subsequently established a more robust perimeter fence around populated areas and instituted regular patrols during spring and summer months. The incident received media attention, highlighting the increasing frequency of human-wildlife conflicts in remote regions as development continued to encroach on natural habitats. For the residents of Verkhoyansky, the attack served as a somber reminder of their precarious coexistence with the wilderness, a relationship balanced between necessity and danger, where a moment's carelessness could result in tragedy. Shrouded Wilderness, 2017. A seasoned hiking group encountered the lethal unpredictability of a landscape known for its abundant wildlife. The region, often called a Serengeti for its diverse animal population, had been established as protected territory decades earlier, allowing natural predator-prey relationships to recover after near eradication in the early 20th century. The area's large carnivore population had slowly rebounded, a conservation success that occasionally resulted in dangerous human encounters. The hiking party consisted of 5 experienced outdoor enthusiasts: group leader Harrison Montgomery, wildlife photographer Camilla Nakamura, retired geology professor Edmund Webster, emergency room physician Alexandra Kostopoulos, and Forest Service volunteer Jeremiah Blackwell. All had completed advanced wilderness training and had previously hiked in bear country without incident. Their planned route traversed an established trail through a remote valley, requiring permits due to its isolated nature. The group had departed from the trailhead shortly after sunrise, hoping to reach their designated camping area by mid-afternoon. Weather conditions initially seemed favorable, with cool temperatures and a light breeze, ideal for the 8-mile hike ahead. However, as they descended into the valley at approximately 8:45 a.m., they encountered an unusual weather phenomenon common to the region, a dense ground fog that reduced visibility to less than 20 feet. Montgomery, with 15 years of backcountry experience, called a brief conference. Standard procedure recommended waiting for the fog to lift rather than continuing with limited visibility in predator territory. However, weather reports via satellite phone indicated the condition might persist throughout the day. After discussion, the group decided to proceed cautiously, maintaining tight formation and making noise consistently to alert wildlife to their presence. For 40 minutes, they navigated through the ethereal landscape, regularly calling out and striking their trekking poles against trees to announce their presence. As they crossed a sloping meadow approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, the fog briefly thinned, revealing ghostly silhouettes of grazing elk in the distance. The group paused to observe and photograph the animals, temporarily lowering their guard and noise level. Montgomery, walking point position approximately 10 feet ahead of the others, crossed over a slight rise in the terrain. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. A massive grizzly bear, later estimated by wildlife experts to weigh approximately 600 pounds, erupted from the fog less than 15 feet from Montgomery's position. The animal had been feeding on an elk carcass concealed by tall grass, a kill it was aggressively defending. The group's noise approach had actually worsened the situation. Rather than giving the bear an opportunity to retreat unconfronted, they had effectively cornered it at its food source. The grizzly charged instantly, covering the short distance to Montgomery before he could deploy his bear spray. The initial impact knocked him backward, and the bear's powerful jaws clamped onto his upper thigh, inflicting catastrophic damage to the femoral artery. The remaining hikers reacted with textbook precision despite their horror. Dr. Kostopoulos immediately deployed bear spray, creating a defensive chemical cloud while shouting commands to the others. Blackwell activated his emergency satellite beacon while Nakamura and Webster hastily retreated several yards, creating escape space for the animal. The bear released Montgomery and vanished into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. The entire attack lasted approximately 12 seconds, but the damage was severe. Montgomery lay unconscious and rapidly exsanguinating from his leg wound. Dr. Kostopoulos applied immediate pressure to the femoral artery while directing the others to establish a perimeter with additional bear spray ready. Despite Dr. Kostopoulos' medical intervention, Montgomery's injuries proved fatal within minutes. The femoral artery damage too extensive for field treatment. The remaining hikers maintained defensive positions around their fallen companion, deeply shaken but disciplined in following emergency protocols. The bear, having established territorial dominance, did not return, though movement could be heard periodically in the surrounding fog. Emergency response, alerted by the satellite beacon, arrived via helicopter approximately 57 minutes after the attack. Poor visibility required the aircraft to land nearly half a mile from the group's position. Ranger Teresa Callahan led a 4-person armed response team through the fog, locating the hikers through radio communication. Montgomery's body was evacuated, while the remaining hikers were escorted to safety. Subsequent investigation revealed the grizzly had killed an elk approximately 18 hours before the encounter, and had been guarding its cache, behavior consistent with natural feeding patterns rather than predatory aggression toward humans. Wildlife biologists identified the animal through DNA samples as a 12-year-old male with no previous history of human conflict. The tragedy sparked renewed debate about wilderness management policies. Some activists called for increased trail closures during fog conditions, while others emphasized that Montgomery's group had followed most recommended protocols. Authorities ultimately implemented enhanced warning systems at trailheads regarding weather conditions and increased mandatory distances from established trails during periods of reduced visibility. For the survivors, the psychological impact proved significant. Dr. Kostopoulos took extended leave from her medical practice, struggling with dreams of patients she couldn't save. Nakamura's subsequent photography exhibition, Threshold, Light and Shadow in Wild Places, explored themes of beauty and danger existing simultaneously. Webster incorporated the experience into his university lectures, emphasizing that wilderness knowledge must include accepting its inherent risks. Jeremiah Blackwell, perhaps most affected, left his volunteer position with the Forest Service and became an advocate for enhanced emergency communication systems in wilderness areas. His testimony before a governmental subcommittee on park safety helped secure funding for an expanded network of emergency beacons throughout backcountry trails. The incident served as a somber reminder to wilderness enthusiasts that in wild places, fog wasn't just weather, it was a deadly curtain that could hide death just a few steps away. Despite all human precautions and experience, wild places remain truly wild, operating under ancient rules where humans were neither apex predator nor privileged visitor, but simply another species moving through dangerous terrain. Forests of Khabarovsk Krai, Siberia, on April 7, 2025, a devastating encounter between law enforcement and local wildlife resulted in one of the deadliest bear attacks in Russian history. Rodion Petrovich Kuznetsov, 39, led a specialized team of 10 officers from the Siberian Regional Police Department, dispatched to investigate disturbing incidents in the villages surrounding the Sikhote-Alin mountain range. For weeks, locals had reported livestock disappearances, property damage, and most alarmingly, 3 residents had gone missing within 14 days. Community members had grown increasingly fearful, suspecting that an unusually aggressive Russian grizzly bear was responsible. The police unit was well equipped, but perhaps underestimated the danger they faced. Having arrived at the area late in the afternoon, Kuznetsov decided to establish a base camp from which they would conduct their investigation. The team split into 2 groups. 9 officers would maintain the main camp. At the same time, Officer Mikhail Antonovich Sorokin took position at a lookout point approximately 300 meters away on higher ground. The location seemed ideal. A small clearing near a stream offered fresh water and good visibility. The officers failed to realize that they had unknowingly encroached upon a bear's territory. Later investigation revealed that they had set up camp less than half a kilometer from a den, where a particularly large male Russian grizzly had been hibernating. The bear, estimated to weigh over 800 pounds, had awakened early from hibernation, likely due to unseasonably warm temperatures that spring. The officers prepared their evening meal, inadvertently creating food scents that would prove fatal. Wildlife experts would later speculate that the combination of human presence, cooking odors, and territorial intrusion created perfect conditions for disaster. As darkness fell across the Siberian wilderness, most of the team settled into their tents, while 2 officers maintained first watch. At around 2:15 a.m., Officer Sorokin reported hearing sudden shouting and commotion from the main camp. He saw a large shadow swiftly moving from his elevated position through the campsite. The bear, likely hungry due to a disrupted hibernation, had charged into the camp with alarming force. The attack was as brutal as it was swift. Officers Dmitry Vasilyev and Pavel Ivanov, who had been on watch, were the first casualties, unable to reach their weapons before the bear was upon them. The commotion awakened the remaining officers, but emerging from their tents only made them vulnerable targets in the darkness. Officer Sorokin later reported watching in horror as his colleagues attempted to defend themselves. He immediately radioed for emergency assistance, but could do little else without risking hitting his fellow officers in the darkness. The attack lasted less than 15 minutes, but its ferocity was unprecedented. By the time the bear retreated into the forest, 9 officers lay dead. The victims included team leader Kuznetsov, weapons specialist Leonid Markovich, tactical officers Nikolai Volkov and Sergei Fedorov, evidence technician Anastasia Sokolova, field medic Viktor Baranov, and junior officers Ivan Zaitsev, Alexei Orlov, and Tatiana Morozova. Officer Sorokin remained hidden at his lookout post until dawn, fearing the bear might return. As first light broke over the forest, he cautiously returned to the devastated campsite to confirm what he already knew. None of his colleagues had survived. Using the team's satellite phone, he contacted regional headquarters and requested immediate evacuation and assistance. Emergency response teams arrived 3 hours later, finding Sorokin in a state of shock. Veteran first responder Grigory Utkin described the scene as a battlefield rather than a bear attack. The victims had suffered catastrophic injuries consistent with the overwhelming force of a large Russian grizzly bear. Regional wildlife authorities, led by Dr. Ekaterina Volkova, conducted an intensive search for the bear responsible. Tracker Mikhail Barsukov identified the animal's trail leading deeper into the forest. After a 3-day hunt, they located and humanely euthanized the bear, confirming through DNA evidence that it was indeed responsible for the attack. Dr. Volkova's subsequent examination revealed that the bear was severely undernourished, weighing significantly less than expected for an adult male in spring. She noted evidence of dental disease and infected wounds on its paws, suggesting the animal had been suffering and likely struggling to hunt its natural prey. Combined with the early emergence from hibernation, these factors created a dangerously aggressive predator. The tragedy prompted immediate changes in departmental policy. All officers operating in wilderness areas would now receive specialized training in wildlife encounters, particularly concerning large predators. Camps must maintain strict food safety protocols, including storing all consumables in bear-proof containers at a minimum distance from sleeping areas. Local villages in the region implemented enhanced safety measures, including regular patrols and improved waste management systems to reduce wildlife attractions. For Officer Sorokin, who requested transfer to an urban precinct following the incident, the night of April 7, 2025, would forever remain a haunting reminder of how quickly a routine mission could turn to tragedy from a single, tiny mistake. Wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, during the unusually warm summer of 2017, an experienced outdoorsman's solo camping trip transformed into a harrowing fight for survival after encountering one of North America's most formidable predators. Thaddeus Mackenzie Thornton, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer and survival enthusiast from Anchorage, had visited Kodiak Island numerous times over the previous decade. Having developed a deep appreciation for the island's untamed beauty and biodiversity, Thornton frequently ventured into its wilderness to document wildlife and test his survival skills. His photography of the island's bears, in particular, had earned him recognition in several nature publications. However, he maintained a healthy respect for the powerful animals and typically observed them from safe distances. On July 23, 2017, Thornton embarked on what was intended to be a week-long solo expedition along the Ayakalik River, a location renowned for its salmon runs and consequently its bear activity. The timing of his trip coincided with what should have been the peak of the salmon run. However, wildlife officials had noted that year's run was significantly diminished due to warming ocean temperatures, creating food scarcity that had altered typical bear behavior throughout the region. After a bush plane dropped him at a remote location approximately 20 miles from the nearest ranger station, Thornton hiked several hours before selecting his campsite. He chose a seemingly ideal spot near a bend in the river, setting up his tent approximately 50 yards from the water's edge. The location offered excellent opportunities for wildlife photography, with clear sight lines along the river where bears often fished. Though experienced in wilderness survival and bear safety protocols, Thornton made a critical error that evening, nearly costing him his life. After preparing his evening meal of freeze-dried pasta, Thornton stored most of his food in a bear-resistant container hung from a tree at the regulation distance from his campsite. However, he kept several energy bars and a package of beef jerky in his tent for convenient access during the night, violating one of the cardinal rules of camping in bear country. Additionally, he had placed his cooking pot with lingering food residue too close to his sleeping area after a perfunctory cleaning in the river. According to Thornton's later account, he fell asleep shortly after sunset, exhausted from the day's journey. Around 2:30 a.m., he awoke to a distinctive snuffling sound outside his tent. Years of wilderness experience immediately alerted him to the presence of a bear. Moving as quietly as possible, he reached for his bear spray, a potent capsaicin deterrent that he kept beside his sleeping bag. Before he could prepare himself further, the fabric of his tent shuddered as something massive pressed against it. In the next moment, the situation escalated dramatically. The bear, identified later as a mature male Kodiak, estimated to weigh approximately 1,200 pounds, tore through the tent's side with one powerful swipe. Thornton described the sudden intrusion as like seeing a bulldozer materialize in my bedroom. The bear, likely drawn by the food sense, immediately began searching the tent interior, destroying Thornton's backpack. Thornton attempted to appear non-threatening while slowly moving toward the rent in the tent fabric. The bear, focused initially on the food it had detected, allowed Thornton a precious few seconds to react. As he scrambled through the torn tent opening, the bear noticed his movement and charged. Thornton reported that he managed to discharge his bear spray directly at the animal's face, creating a momentary distraction that allowed him to gain a few yards head start. With remarkable presence of mind despite the chaos, Thornton made for a nearby rocky outcropping that rose approximately 20 feet above the forest floor. The bear, temporarily disoriented by the spray but quickly recovering, pursued him with surprising speed. Thornton reached the rocks just ahead of the animal and scrambled up the steep surface, suffering deep lacerations to his left calf when the bear swiped at him during the ascent. From his precarious perch, Thornton watched as the bear circled below, occasionally standing on its hind legs to reach toward him. The standoff continued for nearly 3 hours, with the bear periodically returning to the destroyed campsite to consume the food it had found before returning to the outcropping. Throughout this time, Thornton maintained his position despite his bleeding leg wound and the near-freezing temperatures of the Alaskan night. As dawn approached, the bear finally retreated into the surrounding forest, apparently satisfied with the food it had scavenged from the camp. Thornton, suffering from exposure and blood loss, remained on the rock formation for an additional hour to ensure the bear had truly departed. When he finally descended, he found his campsite destroyed. His tent was in tatters, his equipment scattered, and his satellite phone was damaged beyond repair. With his primary communication device disabled, Thornton knew he needed to reach the emergency radio, which he had carefully stored in a waterproof container inside his hung bear canister. Though weakened from his injury and the night's ordeal, he retrieved the radio and successfully contacted the Kodiak Island Ranger Station. Rangers Helena Norris and Marcus Webb responded to his distress call, immediately organizing a rescue operation. The remoteness of Thornton's location meant that help couldn't reach him immediately. Following the ranger's instructions, he used the first aid supplies from his emergency kit to clean and bandage his leg wound, then relocated to a more open area where a helicopter could eventually land. He maintained regular radio contact with the ranger station for nearly 6 hours, while watching vigilantly for the bear's return. A Coast Guard helicopter located Thornton in the early afternoon, with paramedic Samantha Rodriguez descending to assess his condition before evacuation. He was transported to a community hospital, where Dr. Eleanor Chang treated him for the deep lacerations to his left calf, mild hypothermia, and exhaustion. Though the wounds required 27 stitches and would leave permanent scarring, Thornton had escaped without life-threatening injuries. During his recovery, Thornton provided a detailed account of the incident to wildlife authorities and biologist Dr. Nathan Blackwell. The biologist noted that the bear's behavior was consistent with an animal experiencing food stress due to the poor salmon run that season. Typically, Kodiak bears would avoid human encounters when natural food sources were abundant, but the changing climate conditions had disrupted this natural balance. Thornton's experience prompted the Alaska Natural Resources authorities to issue additional warnings to visitors about increased bear activity and the critical importance of proper food storage. Park rangers enhanced their educational efforts, using Thornton's experience as a cautionary example in wilderness safety presentations. The bear that attacked Thornton was never identified with certainty, though wildlife authorities noted increased sightings of an unusually large male throughout that season. As a testament to Thornton's respect for wildlife, despite his harrowing experience, he specifically requested that no attempt be made to track or eliminate the animal, noting that it had simply been acting according to its instincts in an increasingly challenging environment. In the remote wilderness of Russia's Amur Oblast region, during the unusually warm autumn of 2016, a family outing into the taiga forest ended in unimaginable tragedy when a Russian grizzly bear killed a mother while her children watched in terror from nearby. Ekaterina Mikhailovna Sorokina, a 36-year-old biology teacher from the small town of Blagoveshchensk, had planned a weekend nature excursion with her children, 10-year-old Alexei and 8-year-old Nadia. Sorokina, known by colleagues and friends for her passionate advocacy of environmental education, frequently organized outings to cultivate her children's appreciation for the natural world. Having grown up in the region herself, she possessed considerable knowledge about local flora and fauna, including appropriate safety measures for wilderness excursions. On September 17, 2016, the family drove approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Blagoveshchensk to the Khingan Nature Reserve periphery, an area known for its biodiversity and spectacular autumn foliage. The day began ideally: crisp air, clear skies, and forests ablaze with red and gold leaves. Later, local rangers noted that the exceptionally warm autumn had disrupted normal wildlife behavior patterns, with many animals, including bears, altering their pre-hibernation feeding habits and territory ranges. The family spent the morning collecting mushrooms and identifying plant species, with Sorokina documenting finds in her nature journal for later use in her classroom. Around midday, they settled in a small clearing to enjoy their packed lunch. The location, approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest ranger station, featured a picturesque view of the surrounding hills and had been used as a picnic spot by previous visitors, as indicated by an old fire ring. After lunch, Sorokina led her children along a narrow trail that followed a small tributary of the Zaya River, intending to teach them about riparian ecosystems. Approximately 1 kilometer from their picnic spot, they discovered fresh bear tracks near the water's edge in the soft mud. Recognizing the potential danger, Sorokina immediately instructed her children to turn back toward their vehicle, maintaining a calm demeanor to avoid frightening them while ensuring they moved quickly. As they retreated, Sorokina positioned herself behind her children, occasionally looking back to ensure they weren't being followed. The family had nearly reached their original clearing when a crashing sound emanated from the dense underbrush to their right. Before they could react, an enormous Russian grizzly bear emerged approximately 15 meters away, cutting off their direct path back to their vehicle. With remarkable presence of mind, Sorokina instructed her children to slowly move toward a cluster of large boulders, approximately 30 meters to their left. As they began to comply, the bear showed immediate interest in their movement. Sorokina, making a decision that ultimately saved her children's lives, told them to run for the rocks. At the same time, she remained in place, speaking loudly and making herself appear larger by raising her arms, textbook techniques for deterring bear aggression. From their position of relative safety atop the boulders, Alexei and Nadia witnessed what followed. The bear, a male later estimated by wildlife officials to weigh approximately 350 kilograms, charged toward their mother. Despite her attempts to appear threatening by shouting and swinging her backpack, the bear closed the distance within seconds. The attack that followed was swift and devastating. Though Sorokina attempted to protect herself by curling into a defensive position, the bear's overwhelming strength rendered her efforts futile. The children, following their mother's final instruction to stay put no matter what, remained frozen in horror on the boulders throughout the attack. After several minutes, the bear dragged Sorokina's body a short distance into the underbrush before apparently losing interest and moving away from the area, perhaps disturbed by the children's terrified sobbing. Alexei and Nadia remained on the boulders, afraid to move. Finally, gathering extraordinary courage for a child his age, Alexei determined they needed to seek help. Instructing his younger sister to remain hidden, he sprinted to their vehicle, where Sorokina had left a mobile phone in the glove compartment. Though cell reception was poor, he connected with emergency services long enough to communicate that there had been a bear attack. Regional emergency responder Mikhail Petrov received the distress call at approximately 4:15 p.m. Despite the garbled connection and limited information, his team immediately deployed toward the coordinates they could extract from the partial call. Additionally, the local forestry service dispatched Ranger Pavel Kuznetsov, who was patrolling nearby and could reach the location more quickly. Ranger Kuznetsov arrived first, approximately 45 minutes after receiving the alert. Following Nadia's cries, he located the children and secured them in his vehicle before briefly assessing the scene. Emergency medical services, led by paramedic Anastasia Volkova, arrived 20 minutes later, but could only confirm what Kuznetsov had already determined. Ekaterina Sorokina had died from the massive injuries sustained during the attack. As twilight approached, police investigator Dmitry Orlov coordinated the recovery operation, while wildlife specialist Nikolai Baranov examined the site for evidence regarding the bear's behavior. The children were transported to a hospital, where pediatric psychologist Dr. Tatiana Morozova began the process of addressing their acute trauma. Physical examination confirmed that neither child had sustained bodily injuries, though both exhibited symptoms of severe psychological shock. The children's father, Viktor Sorokin, a maritime engineer working in Vladivostok, returned home immediately upon notification of the tragedy. In the following days, he provided investigators with additional context, revealing that Ekaterina had been trained in wilderness safety and had previously encountered bears at a distance without incident. Her background in biology had given her confidence, perhaps too much, in navigating wildlife encounters. The tragedy prompted immediate changes to visitor protocols in the nature reserve. Director Alexei Kuznetsov implemented stricter regulations regarding family visits, including mandatory bear safety courses for all visitors and requiring groups to carry bear deterrent spray. Additional warning signs were installed throughout the reserve, and certain high-risk areas were closed to visitors during periods of increased bear activity. A memorial service for Ekaterina Sorokina drew hundreds from Blagoveshchensk and surrounding communities. Her school established the Sorokina Nature Education Fund in her honor, providing resources for children to learn about wildlife conservation and wilderness safety. Colleagues described her as a dedicated teacher who had inspired countless students to pursue careers in environmental science and conservation. For the children, recovery proved to be a long and difficult process. Both received intensive therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, with Alexei particularly struggling with survivor's guilt. Viktor Sorokin eventually relocated the family to Khabarovsk, seeking a fresh start away from the painful memories associated with Blagoveshchensk. The site of the attack was ultimately marked with a small memorial plaque, placed not to commemorate the tragedy itself, but to honor Ekaterina's love for the wilderness and her ultimate sacrifice that saved her children. Local guides now include her story in their safety briefings, a powerful reminder of the beauty and danger inherent in Russia's wild spaces. Remote, rugged mountains of southern Siberia, April 25, 2025, began as an ordinary day for experienced backcountry skier Nikolai Vladimirovich Terekov. The 38-year-old geological engineer from Novosibirsk had ventured to Ergaki Nature Park, a breathtaking wilderness area known for its jagged peaks and pristine forests, for a week-long solo skiing expedition. The Ergaki Range had been a favorite destination for extreme winter sports enthusiasts since the early 2000s, with its challenging terrain and spectacular views drawing adventurers from across Russia and beyond. Local legends told of ancient spirits dwelling in these mountains, and indigenous Tuvans had long treated the area with reverence, conducting rituals before entering certain valleys. Scientists, however, knew the real danger. The mountains housed a healthy population of Siberian brown bears, cousins to the North American grizzly, who emerged hungry and disoriented from hibernation as spring temperatures rose. That fateful morning, park rangers had posted fresh warnings about bear activity. 3 sightings had been reported in the previous week, all within the eastern sector where bears typically denned in higher numbers. The marked trails had been designed specifically to avoid known bear habitats, particularly during the dangerous spring awakening period. Terekov, according to his detailed journal found later in his backpack, had intended to follow the established Sleeping Cyan route, a moderately difficult trail that offered stunning panoramas while keeping skiers away from potential wildlife confrontations. What exactly prompted Terekov to deviate from the marked path remains unclear. Weather reports indicated visibility was excellent that day, with no sudden storms or conditions that might have disoriented him. His final journal entry, time-stamped at around 8:42 a.m., mentioned his excitement about exploring the untouched powder beyond the ridge, suggesting a deliberate choice to seek fresh snow away from the more trafficked areas. By mid-morning, Terekov had veered nearly 2 kilometers east of the established trail, descending into a densely forested ravine where patches of snow still clung to the north-facing slopes. According to later forensic analysis, it was approximately 11:15 a.m. when the fatal encounter occurred. Valentina Mikhailovna Sorokina and Pavel Dmitrievich Kuznetsov, a married couple skiing along the official route above, became the incident's only witnesses. They reported hearing a sudden shout echoing from the forest below, followed by what Sorokina described as a terrible roaring sound. Peering down from their vantage point, they glimpsed movement among the trees, a massive brown shape lunging toward what appeared to be a human figure. The couple immediately activated their emergency beacon and reported the sighting to park authorities via satellite phone. Dr. Anastasia Yegorovna Petrova, the wildlife biologist who led the subsequent investigation, determined that Terekov had likely startled the bear at extremely close range, perhaps less than 5 meters. Based on tracks preserved in the remaining snow patches, the skier appeared to have rounded a dense thicket of Siberian pine and encountered the bear while it foraged for early spring vegetation and insects beneath fallen logs. Dr. Petrova explained that in early spring, bears emerge from hibernation in a physiological state called hyperphagia. At this time, they are desperately hungry, having lost up to 30% of their body weight during winter dormancy. Their senses are heightened and their tolerance for perceived threats is minimal. A fast-moving object suddenly appearing in their space triggers an immediate defensive response. The rescue team, led by veteran park ranger Grigory Alexandrovich Orlov, reached the scene approximately 57 minutes after receiving the alert. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Terekov's body lay partially obscured beneath a fallen tree, having sustained catastrophic injuries to the head, neck, and torso. His specialized backcountry skis had snapped from the force of the attack, with one binding still attached to his boot. The bear had apparently withdrawn after the initial assault, with tracks leading deeper into the forest. In his report, Orlov stated that in his 22 years working in those mountains, it was the 3rd fatal bear encounter he had documented. He explained that each had occurred when a human entered a bear's personal space during the vulnerable post-hibernation period. Orlov emphasized that bears did not seek out humans as prey, but rather reacted to perceived threats with overwhelming force. Medical examiner Dr. Lyudmila Ivanovna Volkova conducted the autopsy at the regional hospital in Kyzyl. She determined that death had occurred within minutes of the initial attack, primarily due to massive trauma to the cervical spine and subsequent hemorrhage. Tarakov's equipment showed no indications of food items that might have attracted the animal. The encounter appeared to be purely a case of unfortunate timing and location. Regional authorities closed the eastern sector of the park for 3 weeks following the incident, deploying wildlife management teams to locate and monitor the bear population. Using DNA samples collected from the scene, they identified the specific animal involved, a 12-year-old male weighing approximately 380 kilograms, with a previously documented territory that encompassed the attack site. After considerable debate among conservation experts, wildlife officials decided against euthanizing the bear, concluding it had exhibited normal defensive behavior rather than predatory aggression. Tarakov's death prompted the Ergaki Nature Park Administration to implement enhanced safety protocols, including mandatory bear safety training for all backcountry permit holders and the installation of additional warning signage at trail access points. GPS-enabled trail markers were also deployed to help skiers and hikers better maintain their position on designated routes. Marina Sergeyevna Tarakova, the victim's sister and only surviving family member, established the Nikolai Tarakov Wilderness Safety Foundation in her brother's memory. The organization now provides education and equipment for safe backcountry exploration throughout Russia's nature preserves. At the foundation's launch, she told reporters that Nikolai had loved the wilderness with all his heart. She added that he would have wanted others to continue exploring those beautiful places, but with greater awareness of how to coexist with the creatures who call them home. The incident stands as a somber reminder that even the most experienced outdoor enthusiasts remain visitors in wild habitats where ancient survival instincts trump human intentions. As spring arrives each year in southern Siberia, Nikolai Tarakov's story is shared with every new visitor to the Ergaki Mountains. A cautionary tale about respecting invisible boundaries in a landscape where humans are not the apex predators. The densely forested region of Alberta's Wildwoods Provincial Park had long been celebrated for its pristine lakes and abundant wildlife, drawing nature enthusiasts from across North America. Yet on June 8, 2016, this natural paradise became the setting for one of the most tragic bear encounters in the province's recent history. Randolph Elliott Hoffman, 32, and Theodore Winston Caldwell, 35, childhood friends from Edmonton, had embarked on what was meant to be a rejuvenating 3-day camping trip, away from their demanding careers in corporate finance. Both men were moderately experienced outdoorsmen, having completed several backcountry excursions over the previous decade, though neither had formal wilderness survival training. Wildwoods Provincial Park, established in 1978, encompassed over 3,000 square kilometers of boreal forest in northern Alberta. The park was home to a healthy population of black bears, estimated at approximately 1 bear per 15 square kilometers. While bear sightings were common, attacks had been exceedingly rare, with only 2 non-fatal incidents recorded in the park's previous 38-year history. The friends had secured a reservation at Whisper Lake Campground, a remote site accessible only by a 7-kilometer hiking trail. According to the campground registration log, they arrived late in the afternoon on June 6th and set up their tent in designated site number 14, located at the northeastern edge of the camping area, roughly 75 meters from the nearest neighboring site. Park records indicated that seasonal ranger Olivia Margaret Thornton had provided the standard wildlife awareness briefing upon their registration, including proper food storage protocols and bear encounter procedures. Both men had signed the acknowledgement form, indicating they understood these guidelines. Weather conditions that week had been unseasonably warm, with daytime temperatures reaching 28 degrees Celsius, accelerating the snowmelt in higher elevations, and pushing wildlife toward lower grounds in search of fresh vegetation. Additionally, park biologists had noted that the previous winter had been particularly harsh, with heavy snowfall and extended cold periods that had likely depleted many bears' fat reserves, leaving them hungrier than usual during the spring emergence from hibernation. The events of June 8th were reconstructed through forensic evidence and the testimony of Park Ranger Thornton, who had been conducting routine morning rounds of the campground. According to her report, she had reached the main campground area shortly after 7:30 a.m. when she heard unusual sounds coming from the direction of Site 14. Approaching cautiously, she observed a large male black bear, estimated at 180 kilograms, attacking Hoffman near the remains of their campfire. Thornton immediately followed emergency protocol, using her air horn and bear spray while maintaining a safe distance. The noise temporarily drove the bear about 30 meters into the underbrush, allowing her to reach Hoffman, who had sustained severe injuries to his lower extremities and torso. Approximately 15 meters away lay Caldwell, who appeared to have suffered even more catastrophic injuries. Thornton radioed for emergency medical evacuation while attempting to stabilize Hoffman, who remained conscious but in critical condition. The bear, however, returned to the scene within minutes, forcing Thornton to deploy her bear spray a second time while dragging Hoffman toward the adjacent campsite. Her continued use of the air horn, along with the arrival of 2 campers from a nearby site, retired military veterans Somerset Augustus Pierce and his wife, Eleanora Lawrence Pierce, eventually drove the bear farther into the forest. A helicopter medical team arrived at the campground's emergency landing zone at 8:47 a.m., but despite their rapid response and life-saving efforts, Caldwell was pronounced dead at the scene from massive trauma and blood loss. Hoffman was airlifted to Northern Lights Regional Health Center in Fort McMurray, but succumbed to his injuries during transport. The post-incident investigation, led by senior wildlife biologist Dr. Harrison James Westbrook, revealed several critical factors that likely contributed to the attack. The bear, later tracked and euthanized the following day, was a 7-year-old male in significantly compromised physical condition, with body weight approximately 30% below normal for its age and size. Necropsy results showed signs of advanced tooth decay and parasite infestation, conditions that would have made hunting and foraging exceptionally difficult. More concerning was what investigators discovered at the campsite itself. Despite the clear instructions provided by Ranger Thornton, the men had kept food items in their tent, including opened packages of bacon and smoked salmon. They had also improperly disposed of food scraps in their campfire, which had not been fully extinguished before they retired for the night. In his final report, Dr. Westbrook noted that the combination of factors had created what they classified as a perfect storm scenario. A nutritionally stressed bear with compromised hunting ability detected concentrated food sources in an easily accessible location. The animal's desperation overrode its natural wariness of human presence. The incident prompted Alberta Parks to implement enhanced safety measures throughout the province's wilderness areas, including mandatory online bear safety training for all backcountry permit holders and the installation of bear-resistant food storage lockers at remote campsites. The families of Hoffman and Caldwell established the Wildwoods Wildlife Safety Initiative, which now funds educational programs about proper food management in bear country. Through this tragic loss, thousands of campers have since received potentially life-saving information about coexisting with North America's largest predators. As veteran park ranger Thornton later reflected during a provincial park service training session, in nearly every case of bear-human conflict, it was not malice but misunderstanding that created the danger. These magnificent animals didn't want more encounters with humans than humans wanted with them. It was humanity's responsibility to give bears the space and respect they needed. The remote mining outpost of Verkhoyansk Prospect had long stood as a testament to human determination in the face of Siberia's unforgiving wilderness. Established in 1978 during the Soviet-era's resource exploitation push, the small tungsten mining operation was nestled deep within the taiga forest of Russia's Yakutia region. This land was characterized by extreme temperature fluctuations and isolation so profound that the nearest settlement lay 110 kilometers away. On May 17, 2019, unprecedented spring flooding transformed this isolated outpost into the setting for a terrifying wildlife encounter that would test the limits of human survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Mikhail Dmitrievich Kazan, 52, the site's operations manager, had been monitoring the Indigirka River's rising waters for 3 consecutive days as unusually warm temperatures accelerated the mountain snowmelt. According to meteorological records, the region had experienced its warmest April in 65 years, followed by heavy rainfall in early May, which had saturated the already swollen watershed. By dawn on the 17th, The river had breached its banks and begun encroaching on the mining camp's lower facilities. Kazan ordered an immediate evacuation of all 11 personnel to higher ground, recognizing that their position was becoming increasingly precarious. The camp's 3 all-terrain vehicles were loaded with essential supplies and emergency equipment, but the rapidly deteriorating conditions soon rendered even these specialized vehicles useless. At approximately 10:45 a.m., as the miners attempted to navigate a normally passable forest road, they encountered a washout that had carved a 2-meter deep ravine across their escape route. Lead driver Nikolai Fedorovich Petrov later reported that the rushing waters had completely rerouted a tributary creek, creating an impassable barrier that forced the team to abandon their vehicles and continue on foot toward the emergency shelter located at the ridge's summit, some 8 kilometers distant. The group, carrying what supplies they could manage, began their arduous trek through the waterlogged forest as afternoon temperatures reached an unusually warm 15 degrees Celsius. According to Alexei Ivanovich Sorokin, the team's geological surveyor, they had covered approximately half the distance to the shelter when dusk began to fall, prompting Kazan to order the establishment of a temporary camp in a small clearing on slightly elevated ground. Following standard wilderness protocol, the miners created a substantial campfire both for warmth and to ward off wildlife. The Yakutia region housed a significant population of Ussuri brown bears, the East Siberian subspecies of brown bear, known for its impressive size and strength. Like their North American grizzly cousins, these bears typically avoided human contact but could become dangerously unpredictable when surprised or stressed. The miners' situation perfectly aligned with several risk factors for bear encounters. The flooding had disrupted not only human activities, but also wildlife patterns throughout the region. Bears, recently emerged from hibernation, were likely displaced from their usual feeding grounds, pushing them into unfamiliar territories in search of food. Additionally, the miners' hasty departure meant that several food storage containers had been left unsecured at the main camp, potentially attracting predators to areas of human activity. At approximately 9:30 p.m., as the exhausted miners huddled around their fire, Sorokin reported hearing heavy movement in the underbrush about 30 meters from their position. Before anyone could react, an enormous male bear crashed into the clearing, likely drawn by the fire's light and the scent of the group's rations. In the chaos that followed, 38-year-old engineer Pavel Andreevich Kuznetsov was struck by the bear's initial charge, thrown nearly 4 meters before colliding with a tree trunk. As the other miners scattered, Kazan and mechanic Sergei Nikolaevich Volkov attempted to distract the animal by shouting and waving their arms, standard bear deterrence techniques that proved ineffective in this instance. The bear briefly pursued Kuznetsov, but then abruptly changed direction, perhaps confused by the multiple moving targets and the smoke from the campfire. This momentary disorientation allowed Volkov to drag the injured engineer toward a dense stand of larch trees, while the other miners retreated in various directions. For nearly 20 harrowing minutes, the group remained dispersed throughout the surrounding forest, communicating in whispers as the bear investigated their abandoned campsite. Eventually, the animal withdrew, possibly deterred by the fire, which the miners had fortuitously built to a substantial size before the encounter. Once certain of the bear's departure, the miners regrouped and assessed their situation. Kuznetsov had sustained significant injuries to his right leg and shoulder, but remained conscious. Using their limited first aid supplies, the team stabilized his condition as best they could before making the difficult decision to continue toward the emergency shelter despite the darkness. After a grueling 5-hour journey through the flooded nighttime forest, the miners reached the ridge shelter at approximately 3:15 a.m. The facility, built specifically for such emergencies, contained a satellite communication system, which allowed them to contact authorities in Yakutsk. A Russian Emergency Situations Ministry helicopter reached their location the following afternoon, evacuating Kuznetsov and 2 other miners who had suffered exposure-related medical issues. The injured engineer underwent surgery at the regional hospital in Yakutsk and eventually recovered, though with permanent mobility limitations. Wildlife biologist Dr. Dmitry Alexeyevich Baranov, who investigated the incident for the Siberian Institute of Ecology, concluded that the encounter represented a perfect storm of environmental factors. The unprecedented flooding had created a situation where both humans and wildlife were forced into unusual movement patterns and confined spaces, dramatically increasing the likelihood of dangerous interactions. Following the incident, the mining company implemented enhanced emergency evacuation protocols and installed improved wildlife deterrent systems around its remote operations. Kazan, recognized for his leadership during the crisis, later developed a wilderness safety training program specifically addressing the challenges of flash flooding events in bear country. The Verkhoyansk Prospect incident now serves as a case study in Russian emergency management training, highlighting how multiple environmental factors can combine to create extraordinary risk situations in remote industrial operations. As climate change continues to alter traditional weather patterns across Siberia, such incidents may become increasingly common, necessitating new approaches to human-wildlife coexistence in one of the world's last great wilderness regions.